If a person dies, is that the end? The heart stops. The line on the monitor goes flat. Relatives cry. Doctors quietly leave the room. But what if all of this is not the finale? What if it's just the beginning of the strangest and most important story that we are yet to understand? For many years, one man, a doctor of medicine, professor and resuscitation specialist, tried to find the answer. Not for sensationalism, not for religion, but for truth. His name is Sam Parnia. He is not a psychic, not a guru, and not a preacher. He is a doctor who stands every day at the boundary between life and death. And one day, he asked himself the question, if after the heart stops, the brain dies, then why do some patients later report that they heard, saw, and remembered everything that happened around them? Theoretically, this is impossible, but such cases existed, and they became more and more persistent. Patients described doctors speaking over their body, equipment that fell in the corner of the room, details they could not possibly know, because from a medical point of view, they were already gone. We are observing a strange phenomenon, wrote Parnia. After death, when the brain should be shut off, consciousness continues to exist, and it perceives something. At first, no one believed him. They laughed, or dismissed it, hallucinations, residual processes, but he did not give up. Parnia began to document these cases. He compiled one of the largest databases of observations of so-called near-death experiences, more than 900 interviews with people who had been clinically dead and then returned. But what was most surprising, he went further. He decided to conduct an experiment, a real clinical one, under the control of scientists. He and his team placed hidden images on high shelves in intensive care rooms, in places that could not be seen unless someone rose above the body. If a person during the moment of death leaves the body, as many had claimed, they should be able to see these images. And in several cases, they were indeed described. Parnia realized there is something we don't know, or don't want to know. He began to speak about it openly. He was invited to conferences. Journalists requested interviews, but his conclusions were frightening, because they challenged the main belief that death is the end. Consciousness does not disappear, he said in one interview. It leaves the body. The question is not about belief. The question is about observation. And here arises a terrifying thought. If consciousness exists after death, where is it? What does it feel? What does it see? And can we one day establish contact with it? Sam Parnia did not stop at theory. He began to speak about things that medicine prefers to keep silent about. His speeches didn't sound like mysticism. He operated with facts, numbers, and observations. He spoke of men and women who, by all parameters, had died, but returned. And they brought with them stories that were impossible to ignore. I left my body. I saw the nurse drop a pen. It rolled under the couch. I later found it when I regained consciousness. I saw my father. He died many years ago, but he was there. He didn't speak. He just looked. And I understood. It's not time yet. There are hundreds of such stories. People described light, warmth, serenity. Some found it hard to come back. Some cried because they had been brought back. But all of them shared one thing, the sense that death is not emptiness. Parnia emphasizes in his work, this is not proof of life after death in a religious sense. It is an observation of a strange anomaly that science cannot yet explain. We are not talking about heavens or paradise, he wrote. We are talking about something that can be felt, that appears in hundreds of independent cases. That repeats, this is no longer a coincidence. In one interview he was asked, what does a person feel at the moment of death? He answered, consciousness is preserved. The person continues to be themselves. They realize they've died. They hear what the doctors are saying. They see what's happening. but they can no longer respond. This is exactly why many descriptions were frighteningly accurate. People heard themselves being called a corpse, heard the decision to stop resuscitation, heard the doctors calling in family. They could describe instruments, phrases, actions, but how is this possible if the brain, after more than 3 minutes without oxygen, is supposed to be irreversibly damaged? Parnia claims consciousness does not entirely depend on the brain. He compares it to a signal, and the brain to a receiver. When the receiver breaks, the signal does not disappear. It simply is no longer perceived, but it still exists. And if that's true, we'll have to reconsider our entire worldview, because that would mean death is not a boundary, it's a door. Parnia is cautious in his wording. He doesn't say, "This is proven." He says, "We're observing something that shouldn't be, and if it's there, it means we don't yet understand something." And then the main question becomes something entirely different. What if the moment of death is the beginning of a journey? Where does it lead? And most importantly, can it be described in words? One of the strangest cases encountered by Parnia's team happened during a study conducted in a British hospital. The patient had died. His heart had stopped. There was no breathing. Official death was recorded. Resuscitation efforts continued, but it was believed the brain had already ceased functioning. 2 days later, the patient regained consciousness. And then he began to speak. He described in detail what had happened in the room, what words the doctor had spoken, which nurse ran in last, what instruments were used. He even said where the device was located that made a characteristic sound. Everything matched. "But you couldn't have known that," they told him. "I saw it from above," he replied. "I looked at myself, at everyone. I even thought I had died. But I felt calm." Parnia understood. If this is true, it means our self goes beyond the body. It means we don't disappear. We continue to see, to hear, to be. These observations gave rise to dozens of hypotheses, but the most important thing Parnia emphasizes is this. This is not fantasy. This is a recurring experience, among different people, in different countries, under different circumstances. Something happens at the moment when the line on the monitor goes flat, something that modern science cannot explain, but something too real to ignore. Parnia called it conscious death. A paradox? Yes. But if it's true, then our understanding of life and death is not just incomplete, it's incorrect. If we can detect consciousness after clinical death, he said, then perhaps death is not the end of brain activity, but the beginning of something new. He began searching for explanations. He conducted surveys, interviewed hundreds of people who had survived clinical death, compared accounts, built chronological maps, and the further he went, the fewer differences he found. People described the same images: light, space, a feeling of love, something hard to express in words, but all called it home. One patient, a former pilot, put it this way: "It's like coming out of turbulence into clear skies. Everything becomes quiet. Everything becomes clear. You just are, without pain, without time. You simply are." But the most important question still remained unanswered. If this isn't a hallucination, then what is it? Can science peer over the edge, or will the boundary always remain closed? Parnia was in no rush to make bold conclusions, but he did the most important thing. He asked uncomfortable questions. And perhaps in those very questions lies the beginning of the answer. Sometimes Parnia treated his research as an attempt to hear a whisper in a room full of screams. While the whole world was focused on technology, speed, and artificial intelligence, he paid attention to what most prefer to avoid: death, but not as a tragedy, as a phenomenon we have yet to understand. "Imagine you're standing on the shore of an ocean," he said in one interview, "and you watch a ship disappear beyond the horizon. You say, it's gone. But for someone on the other shore, it has just arrived." This is not poetry. It's a new way of thinking. And it's unsettling. Because if death is not the end, but a transition, then many questions arise. Why do some people return from beyond, while others do not? Why is the experience of death so often accompanied by the same images, light, peace, a sense of acceptance? And most importantly, who or what meets us there? Parnia launched a large-scale study involving more than 2,000 patients from around the world. His goal was simple: to separate fantasy from reality. Patients who had survived clinical death were asked the same questions. They were asked to describe what they remembered, what they saw, what they heard. Some described the operating room, others, the conversations of the medical staff. But the most astonishing part was that their memories matched reality. This meant that awareness continued even when the brain was silent. Neurologists couldn't explain it. Theoretically, after the heart stops, brain activity fades within 5 minutes, but consciousness remained. How is that possible? Parnia hypothesized, consciousness is not a product of the brain. It is something separate, perhaps even independent. The brain is just a receiver, and when the body shuts down, the signal doesn't disappear. It simply changes frequency. There was something familiar in this hypothesis. Thomas Edison wrote the same. Mystics said the same. Those who passed through death feel the same. But how can it be tested? How can the invisible be proven? Parnia did everything he could. He even placed images on high shelves in intensive care units, positioned so that a patient could not see them, unless they rose above their body. And some described these images precisely. Without error, this is no longer coincidence. This is a challenge to our entire understanding of life and death. And if it's true, then we all must ask ourselves, what awaits us beyond the threshold? And most importantly, how should we live here knowing this is only part of the journey? At one of his lectures, Sam Parnia said a phrase the audience would never forget. We don't die. We simply go back home. For many it sounded like a metaphor, but for him it was a statement of fact. His research went beyond medical statistics. He studied the structure of consciousness the way others once studied genes or electricity. And the deeper he delved, the more he saw we are only at the very beginning of understanding ourselves. One patient who had experienced clinical death described a moment when time stopped. He felt as though he was floating in light, no fear, no pain, only acceptance. He heard a voice, not external but inside himself, and the voice said, "Not yet. It's not your time." This is repeated in dozens of testimonies, regardless of age, culture, or language. People who had never heard of one another describe the same thing. Parnia admits, it's hard to prove, but impossible to ignore. The scientific community reacts cautiously. Some are open to dialogue, others call him too bold, and some are simply afraid. We've grown used to seeing death as the end, Parnia says, but I see it as a change of state, like water turning into steam, like the sun setting for some and rising for others. He often repeats, it doesn't matter what you believe, what matters is what you do with that knowledge. Because if the soul exists after death, it changes everything. It means that every action leaves a mark, every thought is real, and love doesn't end with the body. In this moment, his words echo those of Edison. If you turn off the phonograph, the sound doesn't vanish, it just stops playing here. In Parnia's laboratories, there is silence, but that silence is filled with anticipation. Every new case, every patient who returns, is like a message from the other shore, and maybe we are standing on the threshold of the greatest discovery in human history, a discovery that doesn't require a microscope, only attention and courage. Because if the door truly exists, and someone is waiting behind it, are we ready to open it? And more importantly, if life isn't an accident, if it truly continues, what will we say about the life we lived when we arrive there? He recalls one case where a patient, who had no pulse for nearly 20 minutes, later described the resuscitation scene in detail. Who stood where, what words were spoken, what happened. Medically, this person was considered dead, but consciousness continued to observe. Parnia emphasizes these stories are not isolated, and although he carefully avoids dramatic statements, the essence of his findings unsettles the scientific community. If consciousness can persist for even a few minutes after brain death, it means our understanding of death as an instant shutdown is outdated. But what if it lasts longer? What if it never truly ends? The question that Sam Parnia doesn't ask directly, but inevitably leads everyone to who studies his research is, what if death is not the end, but a door? In an interview he says, "We are not trying to prove the existence of an afterlife. We are studying what science currently cannot explain. We are ruling nothing out." In these words lies the real intrigue. He doesn't say yes, but he doesn't say no either. He leaves the viewer with the power to decide. And that's exactly what keeps you watching, searching, asking. He describes how some participants in his studies spoke of the feeling of leaving the body and observing events from above. Others said they felt as if they were being guided somewhere. Some heard music, some met deceased relatives, but most returned with a feeling of peace, of light, of love. Parnia points out, these experiences don't depend on culture, religion, or education. They happen to both the religious and the atheists, and although interpretations may vary, the essence of the experience is universal. Something is happening, something bigger. He shares one striking story. A woman who had been in a state of clinical death later recalled how she felt as though she were flying through a vast tunnel of light. Her husband, who had died many years earlier, was there to meet her. He didn't speak, just smiled and held her hand. Then she woke up. The doctors had thought she wouldn't survive, but she did. And from that day on, she kept saying, "Death is not scary. It's like coming home." Parnia isn't chasing sensation. He emphasizes, my goal is not to prove religion and not to destroy it. My goal is to understand what truly happens at the moment of death. And if it turns out that consciousness really does continue, even briefly, we are obligated to study it. And in this, his approach is remarkably honest. He doesn't speculate. He doesn't dramatize. But each of his words rings like an alarm bell. Perhaps we are living in ignorance. Perhaps, right beside us, there is a whole layer of existence we cannot see until we look beyond the edge. At the end of one of his talks, he said, "We don't fear death itself, we fear the unknown. But if even part of what we've heard is true, then death is not disappearance. It's transition, a return, or perhaps awakening." He falls silent. But in that silence, we don't hear the end. We hear an invitation. And without realizing it, you find yourself wondering, what if he's right?